Maybe. Okay, so all right. Hello, Dr. Pickens. Again,
Hi,
I'm Renee. It's nice to meet you today.
nice to meet you too.
We're going to go over, of course, some 10 big questions, and I hope you're ready. I hope that I try to do a little mix so it's not all, you know, try to keep it a little lighthearted and fun, but of course, we got to get to some nitty gritty stuff as well.
Sure,
So let's do the
absolutely.
first one. Let's see. What is the first thing you notice when you meet an individual?
Oh, goodness. I don't know. I think after all this time practicing, the first thing I notice is probably their small the small bits of body language
Mhm.
that you experience in a person, in terms of, and I think why is largely because I think you can tell a lot from a person's intentions from the way they carry themselves. And so, from the perspective of, just meeting a new random person in the world, it gives you an idea of the type of person that they are. If you're working with a client, it gives you more of an idea of where they are in terms of, how they're presenting, if they're restricted, if they're open, that kind of thing. And I think it plays a lot into this idea of many times when we approach new people, we're gauging, whether or not they're safe. And so, it's that sort of that constant interplay that's going on and determining, is this a safe person? How much are they safe in terms of me, being open with who I am and, you know, that kind of thing. So I think the first thing I notice is probably body language.
It's very good. Speaking of safety, we're gonna kind of segues into the next question. How do you turn a safe space into a brave space?
How do I turn a safe space into a brave space? Um, Well, and I apologize. I have a new puppy, and he's just fallen asleep, and he's
Oh,
probably going to start yipping. So if you hear it, that's what that is. Um, a safe space into a brave space. I think, to me, a safe space is one in which a person can experience their vulnerability openly, without fear of reprisal in any way. And brave space is one in which that person becomes comfortable with that vulnerability and safe in that vulnerability enough to take that out into the world, and experience that and allow other people to experience it with them. And so the idea of, it's safe to be in therapy, at least that's the goal, but it's brave to be yourself in therapy, um, with the goal that, hopefully, that whoever that is that's able to come into the room in counseling, um, can one day go out of the room in counseling and be that person can be themselves in the real world. And so you to transition from, yes, it's safe, but it's brave in here to allow that vulnerability to be open with the goal of taking that out into the real world one day.
it's pretty impressive. Uh, where did you first observe the concept of social justice and advocacy? And if you could provide like one example of how you held these concepts in your life.
Mm. Social justice and advocacy, and how I've held the concepts in my life.
Yeah.
Um,
No pressure.
well, I think this is probably, and I'm not certain you want a personal answer to this, but I'm going to give you one anyway because it was the first thing that came to my mind. Um, when I first went to college, I sought out counseling, and it's probably the reason why I'm here now. Um, and I probably the first time that I heard somebody advocate for me and my identity was me going to counseling and essentially telling the counselor that, hey, I'm gay and I want you to fix me. And having somebody for the first time sit across from me and tell me that I didn't need to be fixed. Um, and I guess that was probably I won't say it was the most profound or the largest. It was certainly the first one that I can recall in relation to my own personal identity. And hearing somebody say that for the first time, rather than falling into this idea of that I had seen all my life up until that point. And I've carried that through my life by doing the same thing as a clinician in lots of different ways. So not just with, um, affectional identity, but even, gender identity, any identity, making sure that that safe space is always safe for no matter who walks in or zooms in my case, zooms in to sessions with me. And so I think on a small sort of micro scale, showing that I am a safe person, no matter who they are, is important, um, to show that the profession, or at least that individual's perception of the profession, is one that takes social justice into consideration. That takes that has an open and non-judgmental attitude towards whatever identity that person has.
It's beautiful.
I don't know if that answers your question. I certainly hope it did.
Oh, I think so. I think it interested well, and just also being also part of that community too. I really appreciate that, and thank you for sharing that story. It's very definitely important. Uh, mm, what is the worst thing you have ever witnessed? It doesn't really necessarily whether it's in and out of the profession, just in your life.
Worst thing I've ever witnessed. Ooh. Um, you do crisis work for a long time, you're going to witness a lot.
Mhm.
The worst thing I ever witnessed, I think, and the thing that first thing that comes to my mind, I was working in an IOP, and it was co-occurring. So individuals who came had to have both a mental health diagnosis as well as an alcohol or drug or substance use disorder diagnosis. And I was leading groups. It was a small IOP. There were three of us, no, I take that back, four of us. There were three therapists and the director who worked there. And I was the lead daytime therapist. And I had one other therapist that I worked with because our daytime program was much larger. And she happened to be a student that um, she happened to be I was in my doc program. She happened to be a student that had been in one of my classes the previous semester,
Oh,
um, when she was still taking classes. And so she was actually in her internship at this point. And she was very interested in working in the addiction and field. She had a brother who had a significant addiction background. He was a younger brother. And at one point during our group, or at one point while I worked there, her brother uh, went missing, and nobody could find him. And I remember very vividly doing group one day, and had about 15 people in group, which is too many for group, honestly, but
mhm.
15 people in group for a process group. But and I remember she and I were the only ones working that day, and I remember she had found out while I was in group that her brother had passed due to an
Oh,
overdose while I was leading a process group of people who were struggling with uh, alcohol and drug addiction. And there were literally only two staff members who were there were me and her, and she was struggling a great deal, as you can understand.
absolutely.
And I had a room full of people that I was responsible for, and I was doing my best to manage that situation as best I could. But probably the effect of that on her was probably one of the worst things I've seen. And then also the effect of her, because she's not able to control that emotion in that moment. The effect of her, because it was a small building, the effect of that emotion on her and how that affected the group of people that I had, and me being the only person in the room, in the building, that
Oh
was
no.
really able to sort of step in and manage every other person in that building at that time. That was probably the hardest thing I've seen
Oh,
professionally.
wow. That's that really is impressive. Definitely something difficult to navigate. How would you advise someone if they found themselves in that situation
I don't
based on
know.
your experience?
I don't want it to be, I don't want it to sound like a cop out, but to just be genuine, be yourself. I remember saying to her in that moment, and I remember that we had a big group room, and then her office was directly across from the group room. And I remember, because this was a real world situation, it doesn't work always the way you learn in school. And I remember standing with the French doors open to the group room, and me standing in the middle between her office and this group room, and looking back and forth between both of them and her. I'm trying to figure out what to do with her. And I have a group who care about her and who understand what's going on to some degree, who are also worried. And I remember looking back and forth at them and just basically saying, I don't know what to do. I don't. And I had 15 people that I was responsible for who were paying to be there. And I don't know what to do right now. And we figured it out. So being genuine, if you don't know what to do, say you don't know what to do. You'll figure it out.
That's some great advice. Absolutely. Thank you for that. We'll switch it up a little bit lighthearted. What is your favorite Disney song?
Disney song, specifically Disney song.
That's what
Oh
it
goodness, I'm gonna have to remember
says.
Disney songs. I don't know.
We can do favorite song if you don't know Disney. It's fine.
Mm, I might remember Disney songs. I remember The Lion King, but I don't. Yeah, The Circle of Life. There it is. I was
There you
trying
go.
to remember the name of the song.
Oh
Um,
my goodness. What is the most valuable piece of advice you've ever received, and where did it come from?
the most powerful piece of advice I've ever received and where it came from. I feel like I could answer that easily had I not been asked. Uh, but let's see. I remember when um, I remember when I was in my a course that we called clinical techniques in my master's program. It was the skills two basically. So we had a second advanced skills course, and um, I had a client at the time who was a classmate of mine, but my classmate had some. She did have some significant life circumstances or had, and those were coming out, uh, and even in our practice sessions. And I had a really great professor who was able to navigate all of that with tremendous ease, and that was just very impressive to me that she was able to do those things. And um, she told me when I was struggling with the client because I didn't know what to do. And I remember her telling me that you can't work harder than they do. Um, I was working very hard to fix things for her. So in addition to the don't fix people, I got the speech that I think many therapists get one day is you can't work harder than your client. Um, because at that point you're trying to solve their problems for them, and they're not going to listen if they're not ready. And the the advice of don't work harder than your client applies to so many other circumstances in life. Don't work harder than your students. Don't work harder than your spouse at solving a mutual problem. Work as hard as is reasonable in those circumstances, but you can't fix something for somebody that if they're not ready to go there to fix it. And so don't work harder than your client, I guess is what I'll say given the context, but it applies in lots of other parts of life.
That's some really good advice. So I'm definitely going to try to remember that, especially when I go to residency too. Um, who is your biggest hero?
My biggest hero. Uh, Probably my grandmother. I lost my grandmother when I was 12, but she was also um, a very progressive person when being progressive was not typical where I grew up, and she was always sort of deemed as being a little unusual or eccentric. Um, and I struggled a lot after she passed because the rest of my family was not, but my grandmother was very progressive, and so I look back on that and feel like I lost quite a bit because I only became aware of who I was, or around that time in my life, and I would have benefited a great deal had she lived longer, I think. Um, but I learned a lot from her, so she certainly is my greatest hero.
That's wonderful. And I had a very similar close relationship with my grandparents, so I definitely can feel that. They were my grandparents, especially my great grandmother and my grandfather were my heroes as well.
Mhm.
So what is the where do you see the greatest need for advocacy in our field?
Greatest need for advocacy in our field.
Mhm.
Um, I believe, let's see. I'm sorry, my puppy is now hitting the door. So if that hear that in the background, he's asking to go out, even though he just went out. Um, but let's see, the greatest need for advocacy in our field. I think this one might sound a little bit unusual because I guess I'm so influenced by counselor ed. Um, the greatest need for advocacy is in projecting to the world what our identity as counselors are and how we differ from other professions. I don't really believe that's the direction you're going with that question necessarily. Um, but I don't. I think it. I still. I mean, we're a young profession as counselors. We're post World War II profession, um, and I don't think that uh, many people in the world, students included, who choose uh, to to get a degree in counseling, that when they start that, they don't always necessarily know what they're getting themselves into. And I think we as a profession need to do a better job advocating for into the world who we are in letting people know who we are, how we differ from psychologists and social workers and MFTs and psychiatric nurse practitioners, psychiatrists, because we do have a distinct professional identity they that I think we need to be projecting to the world that we don't do very good at.
Absolutely, that's amazing, and yeah, I couldn't agree more because a lot of people they just, especially the lay people, they just don't know. Yeah, they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you see that particularly in the medical field. They're like, oh, we'll need a social worker or we need a psychiatrist, and they have no idea what the difference between a mental health counselor and a social worker is. They have not a clue.
Right. The amount of times I get asked if I'm going to be able to prescribe something to somebody is uh, a lot.
Oh no. Oh my goodness. So that brings us to our last question. What traditional stereotype angers you?
Oh goodness. Let's see. There are so many. um, let's see. I will leave it within the realm of my own identity and say that the one that annoys me the most is the assumption that relationships have to ascribe to a certain structure in order to be successful. And so I guess the way that I will describe that is the idea of in a same sex relationship that oftentimes I will meet straight people who will want to know from me or my husband, you know, un- given the appropriate given the appropriate gender roles that must be applied to every possible situation.
Yeah.
Which ones do you meet, and which ones does your husband meet? How do you make that work? And the assumption that somehow the stereotype about at least gay male relationships that somebody fulfills a traditional feminine role and somebody fulfills a traditionally masculine role. That one annoys me, and it's probably the most common question I've gotten in my life, and probably why it annoys me the most. Um, And I do think when people ask it, they are being genuinely curious, but they're also being genuinely informed when
Mm.
they ask. It's not my job to, you know, be the teacher for your lack of understanding when you could find this in many ways. Um, but just that assumption probably is the thing, the stereotype that bothers me the most. That one partner fulfills this traditional feminine role, while one partner fulfills the traditional masculine role, and it's because that's not the way it works. And that one probably is the one that annoys me the most.
I'd say that one's up there for me too, because just the same with lesbians. It's a very similar thing, and then being two spirit. It's also it's just
Hmm.
it's like who's the man and who's the woman, and I'm like neither. We're both women.
Right.
So it definitely. So I definitely I appreciate that one. That and with the racial stereotypes, especially being a biracial Native American. Passing as having a very white passing. It's a whole nother bananas things that they do. So I definitely
Hmm.
appreciate that. And I appreciate the time you spent with us today too. Dr. Pickens, it really meant a lot to me. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.